Good morning. Thanks for joining us for a very exciting shared program between the Environmental Professionals Network and the Water Management Association of Ohio, or pronounced in acronym form, WMAO. We have a very full morning of activities, and I recognize that about half of you are going to be attending the first 90 minutes of this program, while others are staying for a full morning of programs with WMAO. So we appreciate this partnership, and we're delighted to sort of be able to join together. There are a number of students with us today, and I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that part of the goal of the EPN at Ohio State University is to sort of connect professionals with students. If you're a student, could you raise your hand? If you have a chance to sort of step up and say hello and talk to them, that'd be great. One of our goals here is sort of connect them with opportunities, and it was great talking with Chad about his experience. He's a graduate of the school, and he'll be speaking with us in a little bit, but he found his opportunity launched from Ohio State through an internship fair, and I think this is the kind of event where if Chad were here in the 90s, we would have been launching him along the way, and he'd take advantage of that. So please take advantage, you professionals that are out there looking for talent or just looking for internships or just looking to pass along great wisdom. Please visit with the students. We're continuing our collaboration this month with Ohio State's Facilities and Operations and Development Department. We work toward making our EPN breakfast programs an official zero-waste event. It is our aim to divert at least 90% of this breakfast program's materials waste from a landfill through composting and recycling. Please help us accomplish this by paying close attention to the signs and instructions. And I have to say, I stepped up here. It is kind of hard still to figure out which bucket to put these things in, Joe. So we got to work on this. But our goal is to divert as much as we can. So thank you for participating, and notice that we do have receptacles for various forms of waste. During last month's program, which celebrated 50 years of the Scenic River Act, I mentioned that this year we are also celebrating the 50 years of the School of Environment and Natural Resources here at Ohio State University. We will be hosting numerous events over the coming year, releasing six posters showcasing our areas of focus within the school, which include soils, wildlife, forestry, water, and human dimensions of the environment. This year is also a time for us to recognize and celebrate the many incredible SCNR alumni in our local community and abroad, including Chad, one of our keynote speakers today. At our April 16th EPN Signature event, our school will be kicking off its year-long anniversary with alumni, stakeholders, and students, and unveil our first poster focused on humans' interdependence and connection with the environment, as a place not only of enjoyment and refuge, but also a resource to be responsibly sustained and managed for future generations. Please stay tuned for more details of our many activities and features this year. That's a shameless plug on my part, but we look forward to celebrating it. If you happen to be an alumni, Mark Giese is here, who is our alumni relations person for the school, and we'd love to hear your stories of anything you'd like to share, because we're going to be highlighting many of those in the coming year. Now let's turn to today's program on flood and flood management. I understand that we actually have a number of people that were not able to attend today because they're actually actively managing floods. So a very timely topic, and we appreciate all those efforts of those folks. We're excited to continue the tradition of joining with WMAO as an EPN collaborator. Water is a topic of major importance to the livelihood of our state and of major interest to our schools, faculty, staff, and students. It's great to have this forum for our respective interests to come together with exciting and relevant talks at the intersection of our most fundamental natural resources. To give the introduction for today's program and of our keynoted speaker, I want to welcome Craig Smith, president of WMAO and an environmental specialist with Ohio's EPA Division of Drinking and Groundwater. Craig.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Joe, for all the work you've done to put this together. It's really a great pleasure for us with WMAO to partner with EPN on these great events, and an opportunity to showcase all the great work we all do. It's also my pleasure to represent the Water Management Association of Ohio, WMAO, at today's joint WMAO and EPN event. For those not familiar with WMAO, we are an organization of water resources professionals representing all aspects of water use, conservation, and management. Our members come from the public and private sectors, colleges and universities, watershed groups, and volunteer organizations. We share one passion, water, and the desire to share what we've learned with others and to in turn learn from them. Today's session is quite timely. The recent rains that have kept some of our participants from actually managing to be here have created flooding that hasn't been seen at these levels in decades. And this spring is not unique, and it's one of the great things about WMAO is we learn perspective. In late March 1913, heavy rains led to the Great Flood of 1913. It was an event that was felt from Arkansas to Connecticut and from Indiana to North Carolina. In January 1937, a storm system brought heavy precipitation to the Ohio Valley. It led to the Great Ohio Valley Flood of 1937, which impacted communities from Pittsburgh to Cairo, from source to mouth. Although our collective memory of these events has faded, the response of our citizens and governments has left a lasting impact on flood preparedness, mitigation, and response. In response to the Great Flood of 1913, our legislature passed the Ohio Conservancy Act. It allowed the establishment of conservancy districts with the authority to implement flood control projects. And it led to the creation of the Miami and Muskingum Watershed Conservancy Districts. This morning, we have the opportunity to learn from three individuals with a vast amount of experience with the tools, laws, and resources that have been put in place to protect us, our economy, and our critical infrastructures. We know that some of you are only participating in the WMAO or the EPN breakfast program and might have questions about floodplain management on the national, local, and state levels. This morning, we have two additional presenters, Cynthia Crecelius and Shawn Arden, who will be speaking during the WMAO portion of the program, and which you are welcome to attend, and we hope you will. We'll invite Cindy and Shawn to join Chad Berginnis on stage following his keynote talk a few minutes after 9 a.m. to answer your questions. And their bios are included in the agendas on your table, and we will give them more appropriate introductions when the time comes. Haven't forgotten about you. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Mr. Chad Berginnis. Today is a homecoming for Chad, since he received his Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from The Ohio State University. Welcome home. Since 1993, his work has focused on floodplain management, hazard mitigation, and land use planning in both the public and private sectors. As a state official, Chad worked in the floodplain management program and was the state's hazard mitigation officer. Chad's been engaged with the Association of Floodplain Managers since 2000, serving as chair of the Insurance and Mitigation Policy Committees. In 2012, Chad took his current position as executive director of ASFPM. So without further delay, please welcome Chad Berginnis.
All right, good morning. Boy, it sounds so good to be back here and hear The Ohio State University. But truth be told, I get so much flack for that in Madison, Wisconsin. So in Big Ten country, we get to joke about those things. Good morning. I am humbled and honored to be here. One of the things in my career that has always been a desire is to come back to my alma mater and talk about some of these very important issues and issues where gosh, I'm now almost 25 years into my career and have been focused on throughout that whole time. And that issue, of course, is flooding. And as I flew in yesterday from Chicago, was noticing Ohio's very soggy right now. And so I don't know if it's kind of an interesting symmetry of things that I come in on the heels of a flood. It's the 50th anniversary of the School of Natural Resources. And actually, it's also the 50th anniversary of one of the nation's keystone flood risk management programs, the National Flood Insurance Program. It's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year as well. So what I'd like to do is start by giving a bit of a national perspective on flooding and flood losses so you can better understand kind of the overall federal framework and how federal policies work and interact on the issue of flooding at the state and local level. Because I hope by the end of the talk you'll understand that we have multiple levels involved here, and the federal level, while potent and while using a lot of resources, it is not the end-all and be-all of floodplain management. But first, I think it's also important so you understand the perspective that I'm coming from in talking a little bit about the Association of State Floodplain Managers. So we're a national nonprofit professional organization based in Madison, Wisconsin. We have 18,000 members. We have 36 chapters in 41 states. And our mission is really to reduce misery, reduce flood losses in the country, but also to work to protect and enhance that natural function of floodplains. As we all learned, back in the days of some of our early coursework, I mean, floodplains are a resource to be protected and to be valued. And so, as a national organization, we focus in a lot of different areas, working on state, national, and even local policy issues. We run the nation's certification program called the Certified Floodplain Manager. We develop tools and publications for the practitioner community to use to be able to do good floodplain management. On our conferences events, I'll do the shameless plug. Our national conference this next year in 2019 is in Cleveland, so we're coming to Ohio, which I'm very excited about. And then we have a flood science center where we do some applied research and working with some different foundations and federal agencies to better understand this issue and the complexities that we deal with in flooding. One of the philosophical perspectives we have as an organization really comes from this man, and I always like to point out if you ever want to do some more reading in terms of flood risk management and understand this a bit better, there's a great biography on Dr. Gilbert White, and he's kind of known as the father of floodplain management. It was back in the late 1930s that he was proposing some of the ideas that are now widespread today. At that time, when you were looking at flood management, it was all about controlling the rivers, right? We can out-engineer Mother Nature. We can, have flood protection, flood control, and that was the end-all, be-all of how we did this in this country. And Gilbert had these radical ideas, such as, we're the cause of the problem. Flood losses are due to our encroachment of the floodplain, and we should have kind of a whole suite of approaches, including these new concepts called non-structural approaches. That's basically, whether it's land use, zoning, planning, some of those kinds of things where actually you're learning to either live with the rivers or stay out of them altogether. And so that's a philosophy that guides ASFPM. We're about all of the approaches in the toolbox, but we tend to focus and really promote the non-structural approaches, and talk a little bit more about those. So this is not a doctor photograph, actually. I talked to the gentleman from the Phoenix News Channel that actually took this, and it's something called a rain bomb. Actually, I don't know what it is. It seems like we have to get kind of really fun and interesting with our weather terms now. This nor'easter was called a bombogenesis or something it was a bad nor'easter. I mean, that's what kind of I think of it as. But this was in Phoenix in the summertime of 2016, and it points to the challenge and some trends that we're seeing. And one of those is that we are seeing more frequent and extreme events, rainfall events in this country. And so this particular event led to only a couple inches of flooding in Phoenix, but that is a huge amount for them in a city that averages about 6 inches of rain a year. That way. And another thing that we're tending to see is that we are having a lot of these billion-dollar disasters. It used to be in the 1960s when the National Flood Insurance Program was created, we averaged about $1 billion a year in flood losses in this country. Right now, we're averaging somewhere between 10 and $20 billion a year in flood losses in this country. Those losses have gone up. And you can kind of see from this map that there tends to be a concentration of these in kind of the south, the southeast, and the Midwest as well. And also northeast. And, Sandy and Irene and some of the recent events in 2012 and 2013 reminded us of that. But these are also increasing. And then last year, 2017, the year that kind of is going to probably break all the records in terms of either billion-dollar events, the total dollar damage in losses, And while, Harvey, Irma, and Maria caused a lot of wind damage, a lot of damage was flooding, and especially the dollar damages when you look at Harvey. And as a country, as taxpayers, we are paying for that. I've seen different studies and reports that they think at least these three hurricanes are probably have resulted in between 260 billion and 400 billion in economic losses, three events. And Congress has appropriated now about 120 billion in disaster supplemental money. And again, I bring that point out because that is taxpayer money from you and me. And it goes to this kind of concept of shared risk management, but also we all have a stake in this, including we're paying for it. And so we need to be more attentive. Now, what I have here is this is actually, it doesn't have to be these big giant events. This is a claims heat map from Detroit from a summertime flood in 2014. And what's interesting is that you see the crosshatched areas are the actual mapped floodplains. One of the things that we tend not to do well in this country in urban areas is really map the true flood risk. And so you see where all the claims are, they're not in the floodplains, not in the map floodplains at all. And we're seeing this in our cities across the country. As we have more of these extreme events, as our aging stormwater infrastructure that maybe was designed with techniques and tools from decades ago that really didn't understand this flooding maybe the way we do now, we simply don't have the capacity in our systems to handle those events. And so this summertime flood event in Detroit actually is the costliest flood in the history of the state of Michigan. So again, there's some interesting piece of this. And of course on our coasts, especially our salty coasts, there are new phenomena that we're dealing with, and certainly led by sea level rise, where we're seeing some of the leading communities, Miami Beach, Norfolk, where residential subdivisions are getting flooded during king tides. And that's an issue as well. And of course, it isn't just our riverine and coastal areas. We have lots and lots of flood risks. Last year may have been one of the best examples of the different flood risks associated with our structural approaches to flood risk management. So this is the Oroville Dam in California. And the Oroville, what's interesting, it is the highest dam in the United States, tallest dam there. And there was nearly a catastrophic failure that would have sent a wall of water many, many feet high down through the floodplain and probably caused even damages higher than Harvey. As it was, 200,000 people had to be evacuated, and right now the repair cost just to fix this dam are over $850 million, one structure that way. So we have risk associated even with our highly engineered flood control structures that we have to be attentive to. And of course in Harvey, you also had two reservoirs, Barker and Addicks Reservoir, where thousands of residential homes were flooded in the known overflow floodplain areas below those. So we have issues. We have lots of issues in this country. We love water. We like to be around it. We like to recreate around it. And yet it is a hazard that is costing us more and more and is something that our generation and future generations are going to have to deal with. So I want to switch gears a little bit to kind of three trends in terms of the future condition. And I hit on one of those in terms of the climate changing. So the most visible way we're seeing this right now in terms of the area of flooding is sea level rise. And we have, for example, in a place like Miami Beach, they're taking an approach to raise roads, raise infrastructures, kind of battle it, a flood defense type of an approach. The city of Norfolk is doing kind of an all the above approach. But they just completed a comprehensive plan that looks all the way to the year 2100. So for those of you that kind of are involved in land use planning side of all this, most comp plans go 20 or 30 years. Their plan's going over 80 years, which is exactly what communities should be doing if you're on the coast and facing future seas anywhere from 2 to 10 feet higher than what we have today by the end of the century. But climate is changing, and also inland. In the Midwest, in terms of the changes in very heavy precipitation events. New England's a little bit higher, but 37% increase is a big event. And even if we have less overall rain, the rain that is happening is coming in more concentrated singular events, which is what causes a lot of the flooding. But let's look at the demographics of this as well. So by 2050, and even though this is an older presentation, we had a demographer from Virginia Tech address one of our conferences about 10 years ago. And these are a couple of the statistics that he had provided. But we're probably projecting about 460 million people. Look at the housing units. I mean, in 2000, we had 116 million. We'll have 200 million by 2050. And we got lots of places that those homes need to go. Non-residential is even more significant. Over 225% increase in non-residential floor space. But maybe one of the most interesting challenges is the lifespan of an actual residential home. So when the NFIP was created, one of the concepts is that, homes eventually 30, 50 years, they'd fall in disrepair, they get torn down, and you'd have new development take its place, it would be protected. But the reality is we kind of like old stuff now. We have this ethic of historic preservation and things like that, and we want to nurse that along. And so what we're building today, especially in the residential area, is something that's going to have impacts for over a century in terms of impacts to future homeowners, but also how we design and construct these things. They've got to last a long time. So the demographics of this issue are something I think to be attentive. And then again, the hazards themselves are changing. There was a report done by the Technical Mapping Advisory Council on kind of the future condition and impact of flooding. And just our normal riverine floodplains are expected to increase by 45 to 55% in the coastal by 2100 in size. And that doesn't include this whole flooding phenomena that we saw in Harvey, which is what we call the urban flooding from too much rain in a highly dense urban area. And those areas aren't even mapped and identified, but when you put all of that together, we have a lot of risky areas in this country that we're not doing a particularly good job managing. And then just a note on the trend in science. And again, when I present at our chapter meetings, we have all kinds of opinions and attitudes on climate change and that type of thing. I always try to remind our professionals in the field, we're about really adapting to it. What is the condition and how in the heck do we adapt to it? Not interested in so much in arguing the sources and causes and all that. But the science is overwhelmingly showing that probably our estimates right now are conservative, and the preponderance of the studies that are coming out are actually showing it getting worse and accelerating. And so there was a headline in the Rhode Island Coastal Management Program, Coastal Manager basically said, we need to plan for a 10-foot rise in 2100. I mean, think about that, 10-foot rise in sea level. Luckily, we don't have to deal with that so much here in Ohio. The Great Lakes system is entirely has different potential impacts and effects when it comes to this change. But I mention that because the effects of what is going to happen on our coast will affect our national economy. There is a 2016 report by an economist from Freddie Mac, which Fannie and Freddie, they're kind of the secondary mortgage market after the mortgage meltdown. Probably over 75% of mortgages were held by Fannie and Freddie. They're called they're quasi-governmental agencies, and his his analysis was about this phenomenon on the coast and basically saying, look, at what point are we going to get smart enough as a nation not to lend in these areas or perhaps not to insure in these areas? And then what does that do to the real estate market? And the point is he was trying to identify the cascading impacts of what sea level rise could do. And what he has concluded is that the national impact, if this happens and it happens in a short amount of period of time where the lending market freezes up, people's values of their homes go down to something close to zero because they will be literally underwater at some point in the future, will be much worse than the housing meltdown in 2008 and 2009 nationally. So we should kind of care about that even here in Ohio, because that's going to be a drag on our economy as well. So we all have a stake in managing our flood risk, whether it's here in our backyard or across the nation. So hopefully you understand maybe we got a problem in the country. And so now I'm going to focus the rest of my time on kind of some of the national policies and programs, the tools that we have that we're implementing from the federal level, at least to work with these effects. And I'm gonna focus actually on 3 different federal laws that I think are probably the big ones. But we have done research and we've identified over 130 federal programs or policies that actually have some impact in flood risk management. And it could be anything from as small as the U.S. tax code to as large as the National Flood Insurance Act. So I'll start with the National Flood Insurance Act. And this is where you get the National Flood Insurance Program, federal government flood insurance, all that comes from this. But the act is really, as I like to challenge folks, I think it may have been one of the most innovative federal programs that we've seen in the 50 years since even, in terms of kind of resource management. Because what it did is it married a couple concepts that never were kind of connected before. It first set up this system where flood insurance is available, but only if communities joined and participated in the program, which means they adopted land use codes and ordinances to manage that risk. It also provided resources to create the world's largest flood map repository. And so we have, in this country, even though we have 3.5 million miles of stream, rivers, and coastlines, FEMA flood maps map about 1.3 million miles of those. And so we don't even have the job done yet. That's kind of one of the interesting things. Even after 50 years of the NFIP, we've still not mapped all these stream, rivers, and coastlines in this country, where a lot of development is occurring. But then it also provides, through insurance and through a grant mechanism, funding and resources to take the existing older at-risk environment and try to mitigate that. Flood hazard mitigation, kind of how we call that. And so it wraps all of these up in one program. And so when, as we're talking the last 2 years on Capitol Hill and giving congressional testimony and things and talking about, well, why don't we just privatize the NFIP, right? I mean, look at homeowners insurance, how successful that is. Well, is it a successful model? I actually argue it's not as successful as the NFIP. We have more communities that adopt local flood codes than adopted building codes. And I mean, Ohio is a great example of that. There's lots of communities in this state that do not have building codes, at least residential codes. Yet a lot of the small villages and cities have adopted floodplain management regulations. The California Earthquake Authority is not a big federal program, and it's all voluntary. So in the middle of earthquake country, an all voluntary approach will get you about 10% of insurance coverage, because really that's about as many folks in California that have insurance against the risk of earthquake. Whereas the NFIP is around 50%. Some areas of the country, maybe even 70 or 80%. So the NFIP is a model, while it has warts, while it's in debt right now to the tune of about $25 billion, it actually is, on balance, a good program, especially to start managing risk in the country. And the one note kind of about the NFIP's debt, And people talk about this like, oh, this program's broken, you have this debt. Well, if it wasn't insured, Congress would just give it as disaster assistance. I mean, so you're paying one way or the other, so it's probably better to pay through an insurance program and at least have some folks pay for some of that risk as opposed to just the handout, if you will. And I don't mean that in a non-sensitive way, but through disaster assistance grants where there's really no strings attached. So again, 50 years of the NFIP, we have 22,000 communities in the program. We have a lot of things we need to do right now. The program is up for reauthorization. There's been a huge battle, actually, in Congress in terms of where this program goes next. And the big dividing line right now is on the role of private flood insurance, because typically what happens, and this is kind of how insurance works, is that you have a risk that's really hard to insure. You have a couple bad disaster years and private insurance leaves town. I mean, they can't make a profit and be sustainable and cover the risk. And so that's why the NFIP was created in the first place, is to be able to do that. And so this is an area we've been very active with, but also, again, it is probably the leading tool in the country when you look at overall land area that affects how we manage flood risk. And I think what's interesting is from the state and local perspective, it is technically voluntary. It's an incentive program. And so a theme that you'll see in the programs I talk about, the federal government can incentivize states and communities doing things, but inasmuch as that land use authority and planning authority exist at the state and local level, the federal programs can only go so far. All right. The second program I'll talk about is the Stafford Act. Probably not many people know that. Actually, I just found out it's the 30th anniversary of the Stafford Act, too. But the Stafford Act is the federal program that really gives us our disaster assistance programs in this country. And so when you see a big flood event unfolding on TV, Urban Search and Rescue is kind of going out and rescuing folks, and all the good first responders doing the things they do, and pets being rescued and everything else. It's Stafford Act that makes all that happen. It sets up mechanisms for interagency coordination and volunteer response. There's a thing called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact called EMAC. And so it provides this mechanism to have a successful response to flood disasters. It also provides the individual assistance to homeowners that were affected by a flood or other natural disaster, or man-made disaster as well. And then it also provides what's called public assistance for infrastructure and buildings. Now, what's really interesting, when you look at Stafford Act expenditures kind of since inception, public assistance is about 75% of the cost. And I find that really fascinating. So while maybe our homes and businesses are becoming somewhat more resilient, i.e. not getting damaged as much, our infrastructure is getting destroyed. And we seem to be putting our infrastructure back in the same stupid places with stupid decision-making without being thoughtful about that. Now not everybody. Not everybody's doing that, but one of the projects we have right now is that we are trying to work with coastal communities throughout the country on capital improvements planning. This is the planning for infrastructure and programming it and funding it and that kind of thing, and trying to understand the practices that communities have. And it ranges a lot. In some small communities, it's like, how do you determine the size of a culvert replacement? And it is, well, it's what we have in the yard over here. I mean, that's kind of how that's all the thought that goes into it, versus some that are very sophisticated, like Norfolk's and everything of the world, that are really looking for sea level rise and multi-hazard resilience into that. There's a huge span that way, but nationally, we're not winning. We have not yet begun to be resilient in the way that we need to, especially against flood damage that way. The Stafford Act also authorizes two hazard mitigation programs, the pre-disaster mitigation and the one that's available post-disaster called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And And these two programs really are the ones that you may be familiar, you see maybe headlines once in a while where a community does a flood buyout, or maybe a community is elevating a set of flood-prone buildings. That's where these kind of grant programs work, and it tends to be focused on structure by structure as opposed to kind of larger structural measures that way. And so again, what it does, it provides incentives to create and maintain hazard mitigation plans at the state and local level. Now, the incentive has a pretty strong penalty at the state level. If you don't have a state mitigation plan, you get zero public assistance. And because that's the biggest part of disaster assistance, there's not a state in the country that's going to say, let's let our plan lapse. I mean, it's not going to happen. And so again, it sets up a system where you have some incentives built in to do, hopefully, things that will make a community more resilient. And I should say that the 2017 hurricanes seem like that they're going to go down, at least in kind of the record books at this point, as being the costliest to the taxpayer through federal disaster assistance supplemental spending. So that's why things like the Stafford Act become so important, because you can reinforce old behaviors or try to influence new behaviors by how that spending works. And that's kind of the policy area that we as ASFPM like to work in. Now, the third, and this is also a very significant law, is the Water Resource Development Act, or WRDA, as we call it for short. And WRDA comes along every couple years. It used to be about every 2 or 3 years we'd have a WRDA. And what this act really does, it authorizes a lot of the structural flood control projects that we have in the country. It authorizes the Corps of Engineers. It is the main law that kind of deals with how the Corps functions and their planning processes and the projects that they work on. And it funds things like dams and levees, navigation enhancements, dredging for our shipping channels, and in more recent years has done a few more green things like environmental restoration as part of the things, beach nourishment, dune restoration, and such. But WRDA has been a vehicle for some really important laws in the country, and perhaps one of those was the '96 WRDA that actually helped create our National Dam Safety Program. And so we have, I believe now all 50 states or 49 states have a state dam safety program. And again, whether it's looking at the Oroville Dam or even post-Harvey after some of the reservoirs there, or even in places like South Carolina where in flooding in 2015 and 2016 resulted in the failure of over 100 dams. The risk of dam failure or dam overtopping in those areas becomes very, very important. And so the '96 WRDA established that, but then the 2014 WRDA established a national levee safety program. And that program, unfortunately, and this is also a trend we see in Congress, they will authorize things, which basically says we allow it to happen, but they will not appropriate things, which is to provide the funding and resources to make it happen. So we have lots of interesting and important programs. I don't want to discount the importance and value of structural flood control. It helps protect our urban areas in particular, and areas that we have dense development, but there are also realities and risks associated with that, including what we would call residual risk, in case the dam or levee overtopped or failed. And also, we see a phenomena sometimes on intensification of risk if let's say a new levee or a flood wall has undeveloped areas behind it. The notion of protection that people have usually means a lot more development goes in there. And so, but again, these are tools in the toolbox. Today's floodplain manager needs to be able to access every single one of these kinds of tools and work with those to apply those in their communities. So, other federal policies and programs, there are a ton of them, and I'm just highlighting some of the bigger ones. But again, by no means is this a all-inclusive list. Community development block grants. If you recall, after Sandy, HUD kind of did this competition, a $1 billion competition to award funds for about 8 projects to enhance resiliency, and that came out of the Community Development Block Grant. Small Business Administration actually has a role. They provide low-interest loans, and the program's a little misnamed because they also provide loans for individual homeowners as well. And those loans can be used to fund hazard mitigation, such as additional cost of elevating your home, floodproofing your business. The Coastal Zone Management Act, of course, I mentioned before, you think you have it hard here in Ohio, at least you're not a saltwater coast manager. That has got to be a very difficult job in terms of the daunting tasks, I think, that are ahead for a lot of those folks. But CZM, from a legislative standpoint, it's kind of interesting because it's not just focused on resource management, it's on economic development and kind of a more holistic kind of framework for managing a geography, if you will. So also very important. Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act. A lot of our stormwater approaches, when we think of urban stormwater management, where did that come from? Well, that actually had its roots in the Clean Water Act, where urban communities had to get serious on water quality, and then you start managing the quantity side of this thing. Endangered Species Act, there's a thing called the Coastal Barriers Resource Act, and that's also tied in with that. We have research and development programs. Everybody from the Department of Homeland Security has a program called Flood Apex, where they're doing things with like big data and artificial intelligence and deep learning to try to help solve some of these programs. To the Corps of Engineers Institute of Water Resource, it's a big acronym. I didn't want to clutter it with more text there. But again, some of our federal agencies have their own in-house research and development, which becomes very important. I mentioned our tax code. One of the things that, and of course, again, as a kind of a self-professed flood geek in all of this, I'm watching the tax debate wondering about what's going to happen to the casualty loss deduction. Yeah. Okay, yeah, right. Woo! And so the casualty loss deduction is a provision in the tax code that allows people with no insurance to write off losses. Now, think about that again if the federal government can incentivize or disincentivize actions, what do you think that does? Now, I'm not suggesting that we be unfair towards folks that have been just recently experienced a flood or things, but we don't have in the same tax code, we don't have an incentive or a tax break necessarily for doing hazard mitigation. And yet it was one of the things of all the changes in the tax code, somehow at the 11th hour, the casualty loss deduction, it was out, it was in, it was out, and then it's in again. So it's a very popular tax break, but it's a tax break that actually incentivizes the wrong behavior that way. And of course, a lot of our science agencies like USGS and NOAA, we have programs, the National Resource Conservation Service, but even the Economic Development Administration, they get involved in these kinds of things. And again, we have researched and found that we have at least 130 programs federally that have some impact on flooding and flood issues. So here's the bottom line, and at least I think I can stop about 5 minutes early so we can get to some of the Q&A, is that federal programs and policies do a good job of incentivizing action, but that's also kind of a practical limit, right? We don't have land use authority, we don't have zoning authority, we don't have planning authority at the federal level. That rests at the state and community level. Federal programs are also very good, and I would actually say essential, to providing data and research resources, whether it be for research institutions like Ohio State, whether it be through agencies' own in-house R&D programs. Those research resources, as well as data, and especially setting consistency standards for data, is also something that is really important at that level. We've got to examine disincentives, though, in our federal programs. I mean, one could spend their entire career and focus all of ASFPM's effort on just eliminating disincentives. I mean, you have programs that are well-meaning and then only to be stopped by another program that has a disincentive to that happening. And again, the one example I mentioned is even in the tax code, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then finally, the main conclusion is that this is a cooperative effort. And I know Shawn and Cindy are going to be talking afterwards really about that kind of state and local level perspective, and the private sector as well. I mean, and the individual. It's incumbent on all of us to solve the flooding program. If there's one thing I've learned in my career over all this, and I kind of laugh when somebody, well, I don't laugh. But flooding is something you will never solve with one approach in a community. You just can't do it. And if you think you can do it, you're kind of deluding yourself a little bit. Flood problems are complex. They involve the physical environment, the social environment, and we have to have an entire array of tools that we apply on that problem to actually result in meaningful resilience in both the short term and long term. So I want to thank you for at least listening to a little bit of my thoughts and rants and things like that, and also invite you, if you've not, if you never heard of us, our website is floods.org, and again, at the bottom in particular, you might be interested in, we have a link to our Flood Science Center. That's, again, our group of staff that are doing kind of the research projects, and we're partnering with universities, foundations, other nonprofits, and so there might be a lot of interesting things there. And so, again, this is one of my favorite quotes of Gilbert, and I think it's kind of this continuous improvement paradigm that we have in floodplain management. The present status of floodplain management does not encourage complacency. On balance, progress has been far short of what is desirable or possible, or what was envisioned at times when current policies and activities were initiated. We have to iterate, we have to continually improve, or we're underwater. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad.
Yep. Do I?
Yeah, please.
Shift over here.
At this point, I would like to call Cindy and Shawn up, and we'll have a panel discussion.
And we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. So please just raise your hand if you have any questions for our panelists.
Well, at least let them sit down first.
Hello, panel. Morning.
Hello, Peter.
I've done a lot of work throughout my career on flood insurance studies and trying to revise flood insurance studies. And in light of the changing environment, the changing climate, we're having a lot more frequent, very heavy storms. We're having additional flooding. National Flood Insurance Program, at least the mapping portion of it, is largely based on mapping the 1% annual chance of occurrence flood, or the 100-year flood. In light of the changes in climate, I would dare say that if you went back to communities that haven't been mapped in 10, 20 or more years and redid their studies, their flood boundaries would be significantly larger, which means we're out of date almost from the time we publish a new flood map. Has there been any thought given to going to some other standard than the 100-year flood?
Yeah, so, and I'll just speak loudly. One of the things that's interesting, and again, paying attention to some of the innovation at the state and local level, and hopefully at the national level we'll catch on a little bit. But Harris County, Texas, so in the aftermath of Harvey, again, the situation that you had down there, if you're not familiar, anywhere from 30 inches to 50 plus inches of rain in an area, that's going to overwhelm your systems. And of course, in an urban area, you just simply had widespread flooding everywhere. But Houston's had smaller rains causing lots of impacts as well, and they're probably the poster child in the country of this phenomena of urban stormwater flooding that's not mapped. It's not tied to that 1% chance floodplain. And so what Harris County has just done in January is they are now basically applying their standards to the 100-year as well as the 500-year floodplain and are thinking about even going beyond that because they're recognizing that the mapping is not adequate that way, but they also aren't exactly sure right now on how you map some of the urban stormwater. So they're using then at least the next level of mapping. Norfolk, they just passed a zoning code last month. They're actually doing the same thing. They're going out to the 500 year. Now, I think in both cases, they're using the 500 year as a proxy for this more widespread flooding phenomena. And in the meantime, at the federal level, the National Academies of Science is doing a study right now on urban stormwater flooding and going to make recommendations this summer in terms of some approaches that we might map and manage those. But it is an issue. It's happening a lot in our communities. And I know even from ASFPM's standpoint, we're saying you need to map and identify these other flooding areas. But urban stormwater in particular, the whole mapping issue is very complicated because it really doesn't lend itself to kind of a statistical frequency type of mapping. So I don't know if
The other side of that, Peter, is the National Flood Insurance Program picked that standard, and it was tied to basically the existing data that was available through some of the large agencies like the Corps and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. But they have never said, don't look at these other standards, or as Chad's noting, like urban development. So they've always opened that up, and particularly with the Cooperating Technical Partnership Program, they're giving communities the opportunity to use future conditions, to include different data sets for, what they want to look at as that risk. Now, the downside of that is there's also no funding. So it becomes then the community or the county or the state's effort to man that. But Licking County in Ohio has used future conditions, and Shawn, are you aware of anybody else that's got?
The only one I'm aware of.
So, that the problem's been recognized, and they open the door, if you have a funding mechanism, to do, studies at different levels and different frequencies and events.
And I'll just add on here quickly, from an engineering standpoint, one of the data gaps that we have is we develop our models and our maps that go into these studies based on backwards-looking information. We do not have data sets available for 100-year rainfalls that are maybe forward-looking for the upcoming 50 years. And that is something that we really need to resolve and incorporate into our studies as we move forward.
You've alluded to the impact of urban stormwater, and I'm wondering if you could say any more about that, particularly in terms of our stormwater management strategies. Do those have any impact on flooding? And if so, can you say any more about what those impacts might be?
So yeah. So, when you kind of look at the age and maturity of kind of these programs and areas, I would actually argue that urban stormwater flooding managing for the quantity side, is actually a relatively young space. One of the things that I found is that it was, in the 1970s and 80s, we were starting to manage urban stormwater from a quality standpoint and beginning to do quantity, but it wasn't until the late 1980s, possibly even early 90s, that some of our leading communities started really managing from a quantity standpoint. And so what you have is that, certainly there's value in capturing, the first quarter inch, the first half inch, the first inch of rainfall, and it actually has an impact on flood loss reduction. What will be interesting, though, is to look at it in the context of climate change. And so, again, if we're having more intense rainfall events, are we kind of negating that? And at least the trend that I'm seeing is that there's a lot of communities really being thoughtful about that, managing these low-frequency, high-impact events from an urban stormwater standpoint. So, like the city of Austin, Texas, most of their stormwater infrastructure is sized to the 100-year precipitation event. We have a few communities that are doing that, but like in Houston, and talking to Houston officials, they got excited that they finally were able to get their standards up to a 10-year event. So we have this huge disparity in range, and those are communities with standards. Let me remind you that there are a lot of communities in the country that don't have the standards even in place. And then finally, the last aspect to that is the funding. And again, stormwater utilities, I think, are a good way to be able to help address it. There will never be enough federal resources to do that. Yet there are some areas of the country that the concept of a stormwater utility is very foreign. So there's I think it's going to be a very active space, and one that we're going to have to figure out and address, because with these more intense precipitation events, we've got to manage them a lot better. Thank you.
So as you guys have said, there's little investment and money going to these management programs. What do you recommend for communities to do for management strategies if they don't have a lot of money to go to the management?
So from the local level, I think an avenue needs to be explored is engaging the private sector into these plans and reinvesting in their communities. It does take a lot of voices to put together a comprehensive management plan to address flood risk in our communities. It's not one person, as Chad mentioned, it's not one solution. And money is short across the board. We're seeing with the federal budget, as the deficit increases, as entitlement spending increases, the amount of money that's set aside for floodplain management and other such programs is going to decrease over time. It's expected. Funding from the state level is also being pinched. Municipalities, I don't know too many municipalities across the state that have a lot of extra money that they're bragging about. So it's how do we work together? How do we leverage all of our resources? How do we bring in external investment into our communities to try to set them up for future success? Because there are some severe consequences for communities that may not act accordingly. And that can be anywhere from folks migrating away from their communities. We saw after Katrina, after Harvey, folks that left New Orleans, folks that left Houston, they didn't come back. Smaller scale, that can happen to some communities in Ohio as well if they're hit by multiple repeat events. Impacts on property values as well. So there are consequences for inaction, and we need to all work together, public sector and private sector, to help invest in our communities.
The other side of that is there's leverage and there's planning, and we don't tend to do either of those two things unless we have to. But if a community recognizes its risk and it has a strategy for how it wants to address it, you'd be surprised the number of funding opportunities and partners that you can find out there to help accomplish it. But usually we address it only in the crisis or after the fact. So when you don't go to the table with a plan in hand, then you're at the mercy as a community of the state or the federal programs. And if you don't know them well and you're not prepared to be a good candidate to partner with them, you lose out on opportunities. And that's kind of an uphill battle we've been fighting. And I think in Ohio in particular, the longer we go between events, the harder it is for a community to keep focused on those programs and those risks and how they want to manage them.
So if communities raise their stormwater standards from a 10-year storm to a 100-year or 500-year storm, it seems to me it's unlikely that most urban development sites can store that much water on site. So as that argues for infrastructure like pervious pavement on every street in a community to get water back down into aquifers, and greater land use planning so we can store some water in certain areas within a municipality that doesn't have at-risk infrastructure, say in a park perhaps. And finally, are these increased efforts being adequately coordinated between stormwater program managers and floodplain managers, so there's a comprehensive policy and hydrologic study interface between those programs?
Well, this is, no, there's not adequate coordination, and but I also think this is an exciting opportunity. I mean, some of the areas, and I think USGS is doing some of this active research as well as others, but what are the impacts of some of the green infrastructure techniques? Whether it's pervious pavers, whether it's biofilters, the Chicago Public School District. Talk about an innovation. This is really cool. I saw this last summer. Is the Chicago School District is retrofitting playgrounds in there. So you have the postage stamp with the school and the fenced-in playground, and they're turning the playground into a stormwater management feature. And so we have the knowledge and the ability to basically have the area maybe replaced with a turf or with permeable pavers, bioretention, and those kinds of things. And they're able to store on some of these playgrounds between 160 and 250,000 gallons of water in terms of doing that. So yet that's a school district, that's the Chicago Water Authority, and their floodplain management is somewhere else entirely. So I think one of the big challenges that we have is we have the managers of infrastructure, and sometimes in that's subdivided between stormwater, wastewater, other types of infrastructure. We have planning departments in communities. We have floodplain managers that a lot of times are in the building department. We have the emergency management. You have all these different agencies and entities, and they may or may not coordinate well together. So I think, again, on the green infrastructure side, we need good data and studies to evaluate precisely what kind of impacts so that we know where we put these measures in and what effects they're going to have. And at the same time, we've got to do a much better job of coordinating.
Hello, panel. You look fabulous. And you look very comfortable too, by the way. Chad, thanks for coming back. I'm sorry you're badgered all the time. Okay, that's enough of that. I'm just wondering, from a national perspective, and you see far beyond the region that we live in, Shawn, we're working on a project, mitigation strategies for flooding issues in some local communities. Here, from an engineering perspective, I get all the structural approaches. I understand detention. I understand hydraulic improvements, HMGP, for example, to get repetitive loss structures and do things like that. Is there anything else you're seeing that's innovative or creative somewhere else in a part of our wonderful country that we're just not doing or seeing here that we should consider in terms of a flood mitigation strategy? And also, is there anything else you're seeing from a funding standpoint that we may not know about that we should consider?
No, there are. I'm just trying to figure the things I want to say. I think to Peter's earlier question, mapping. We can do a far better job in mapping. And again, I'm trying to thread the needle here because it's important. The FEMA mapping that's done is important. As I said before, we haven't even done the job. When I was the county planner in Perry County here in Ohio, we had what we call the blob flood maps. Essentially, it was a flood zone that was drawn in, no real data behind it. And, I would pick up 10 square miles of drainage before the first floodplain would appear, and yet private property owners wanting to develop small rural subdivisions up in those areas. So we had no data. So I would say the first thing is where I'm seeing effective communities is that they're doing a lot better job mapping. They're owning the mapping, so to speak. They're going into, was just talking to one of the folks from Charlotte, North Carolina. They're mapping floodplains all the way up to a 60-acre drainage because in urban areas, that's where they're seeing actual flood risk happening. And then having forward-looking mapping as opposed to rear view mapping. And some of the techniques are kind of being developed that way, but you can plug in higher precipitation values You know, you might be able to plug in some of those. I think that the science is kind of evolving that way, but just doing more comprehensive mapping, and again, the failure zones from dams, levees, and some of those types of things, that's one area. Regulatory, again, the NFIP has basic standards you have to follow, and there are a lot of innovations from a regulatory. Now, I understand, especially MWCD land, that may be a harder sell in a lot of your geography there. But I'll take subdivisions, for example. Probably the weakest part of NFIP standards have to do with subdivision design. We actually put out a document jointly with the American Planning Association in 2016 that identified 60 higher, better standards for subdivision design in dealing with flood risk areas. And that becomes really part and parcel of this, right? I mean, if you actually have standards that require the properly sized infrastructure that goes in there, then you're not having to come back 10, 15, 20 years later and redesigning it, digging that stuff up and putting something in that should have been right-sized in the first place. And then I think the third thing maybe is a bit on financing. Some of the cutting-edge stuff that we're seeing on financing, and this probably gets into maybe some of your larger communities that have, that deal with bonding authorities and things like that. But we're seeing this thing, there's a lot been talked about public-private partnerships. In the water infrastructure business, I think there are pluses and minuses for sure, but there's the emergence of something called catastrophe bonds. And what we're seeing develop in the private market is there's a lot of capital in, especially in the reinsurance market and in some of the in the financial markets, and they're trying to figure out how to apply it to these kinds of infrastructure. And so we're actually starting to see some of the capital programs. Willis Towers Watson, they're a large global reinsurer, and they are marketing catastrophe bonds to help finance some of these. So there's some help in the financing arena as well. So those are probably three things.
All right. Chad, you mentioned critical infrastructure and how it gets put back into an area after a disaster. There is one part of this critical infrastructure that we have that's kind of dear to my heart, which is our water supplies. And obviously we have if we move can't move our drinking water wells or our intakes away from the flood zones. Could you address some of the programs and incentives that are available to help harden and protect that part of the infrastructure, or discuss any projects you're aware of that we've undertaken to both meet the needs to protect our floodplains and still have access to these critical resources when we need them?
So from a water supply perspective, and actually I want to talk about wastewater here too, because this misperception has been there as long as I've been in this field. But water supply, I think, has to do with, again, planning and standards. That's probably where you can make the most impact in doing that. I believe, my knowledge is getting dated, I think state of Ohio there's a state law on your wellhead. Yeah, in terms of doing that. And so having those kinds of standards is important. Now, not having that standard coast for a decade or two without kind of checking the science could be, so if you're in a coastal area, for example, you may want to increase that standard over time. But in terms of location, and not maybe as much water supply, but wastewater, one of the things I heard time and again, either here in Ohio or even nationally as well, we have to have our wastewater treatment plant right next to the creek or river or discharge point. No, you don't. You've never had to do that. You choose to do that because probably you want a gravity system that is the lowest cost alternative to do that. But with pump stations and things, you can put these things anywhere. And yet in floods, one of the very high dollar piece of infrastructure that we pay for time and time and time again are repairing wastewater treatment plants. So in terms of funding and kind of mitigating those, a program that most people aren't aware of if you have a flood disaster, and in fact, this is probably good timing. If Ohio gets a federal disaster declaration from these recent floods, and it's declared what's called public assistance, there is funding to repair that damaged infrastructure. There is a component of that program called 406 mitigation, and that will pay to actually help improve its resiliency or its flood defense. But what we find in that program actually being deployed nationally is what is sometimes the FEMA folks, sometimes the state folks even are complicit and not talking about it or trying to apply that program. And honestly, you're leaving money on the table if you're not trying to look at that resiliency and build it in. So the last FEMA director, Director Fugate, was really big on 406 mitigation. And so I just mentioned that because if you know nothing else, and if you own that infrastructure and you have one of these FEMA teams come in and say, hey, I'm assessing it, ask about 406 mitigation, because they should be able to be knowledgeable to tell you on how you can access and leverage those funds.
Hi, I'm a graduate student here, and I work with remote sensing data. And I was just wondering if you could speak to any partnerships or effects that remote sensing data is having on a policy, or as it relates to floods, imagery, things like that. Are there emerging partnerships between like groups like NASA or other imaging satellite groups and things like that? Sorry. Yeah.
So one of the things that that we're seeing in the flood field is being able to apply and some of these concepts of big data, remote sensing, satellite data into meaningful products, tools that can actually influence decisions, right? I mean, it's good to have those things, but if you can't, I kind of look at it very much from a practitioner side. If you can incorporate that into a tool or a product that you can use, it may be good planning data and things, but maybe limited in others. So after Harvey, one of the newest assets we have nationally is called the National Water Center, and it's down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and it's a joint federal. Several agencies are involved with it, and the concept actually is a bit more in the area of flood forecasting, and so when you look at our network of stream gauges across the country, we have a couple thousand data points and things. What it's trying to do is use kind of big computing, deep learning, and have virtual data points of a couple million across the country, even on some of our smallest streams and rivers, to be able to better predict flooding and flood levels in the country. And actually, that kind of goal and that program is still in development, but they actually got to test it a little bit in Harvey. And I tell you, I think it has a lot of promise in terms of being able to be actionable from like a flood response standpoint and possibly even flood recovery. One of the innovations I'm kind of keeping my eye on is you're seeing, especially in the area of space technology, the cost of satellites just plummeting. We're getting more efficient that way, and I think there's probably a big role in terms of satellite data, remote sensing data and things, and especially post-flood, where you can see the inundation areas, you can incorporate that into future plans, and you can study. And again, I kind of go back to Harris County, Texas, was talking to one of their floodplain management folks down there, and they actually analyzed where they had the flooding, compared it against their regulations and standards to actually make recommendations, smart recommendations on what they need to change or improve. And so I think being able to apply those kinds of data sets, run them through scenarios and figuring out, okay, using this data, this is where we need to improve our programs, this is where we need to go with it. So.
Time for more question?
Hello. Do you foresee any change in the public's perception of detention and retention in terms of quantity and quality? Because we do have lots of basins that the water goes in and goes out real fast, and a lot of people don't like to have standing water in detention or retention basins. Do you foresee like bio-retention basins being one of our solutions where we're actually retaining our water instead of flooding our streams?
Public perception is probably one of the challenges that has been there when I started and will be there when I leave in terms of doing that. I mean, I always try to remind myself that, in a group like this or whatever, we talk water a lot. But the reality is the perception of property owners, and actually kind of give an example through a condo association. A lot of times a condo association may actually own the infrastructure, the stormwater pond or that type of thing, and be responsible for maintenance on that. But to those property owners, they just pay their association bill and they see this amenity until it doesn't become an amenity. It's something, that there's something wrong with it. And I gotta say, I've not seen meaningful change in the public as a whole in terms of recognizing risks when it comes to these kinds of things, because then these same associations are really surprised. They get a flood or something and an inlet's damaged, or perhaps they need their retention or detention facility maintained, and all of a sudden they have to have a special assessment, very expensive to fix those things. I think it's incumbent, again, on community officials to plan and to anticipate that and translate that into good codes and standards so that people don't have to worry about that so much. I mean, it's we'll continue to try to do it, K through 12 education, where we're hitting kids at the time that they're really open to learning. There's a diversity of things out there. We just finished a research project that we compiled all the K-12 resources that we're aware of across the country. So now we have a compendium of that on our website so that public officials from other communities can use and things. But it's tough. It's tough to get people to understand that there's risk there. One thing I do want to mention before, if you're a student here, we are always looking for good talent at the ASFPM Executive Office, and we do hire interns. We have project employees, and we actually have a job posting up right now for a training coordinator. So if you're interested, Madison, Wisconsin, yes, it is the home of the Badgers. I do get badgered. But it's a beautiful city, so we'd love to have you there. And if you're interested, just see me. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. A big round of applause for our panelists. We do a lot of programs on water here at the Environmental Professionals Network, and I have to say I am always amazed and impressed with you that work in water management. It's kind of like you're kind of MacGyver-likes, have to sort of figure out like how to make do with what you have available, and it's like we have this impending storm on the way, and it's like nobody's listening quite as well. So I really appreciate your tireless efforts to sort of like manage a risk that is going to be very substantial in the future, and hopefully we can hear more people stepping up to the plate and taking this seriously. As is our tradition of the Environmental Professionals Network, we have certificates of appreciation that we'd like to offer each of you. This is an image of the Olentangy River right outside here, so on the mighty banks. Ohio State sits here. Thank you very much. I'd like to bring to people's attention that we do have some additional programs coming up with the EPN that I'd like to excite you about. The EPN signature event is on Monday, April 16th. This will be an exciting program on sustainability. We'll have representatives from Patagonia, Owens Corning, and Jenny's Splendid Ice Cream talking about achieving sustainability in their supply chains. Then at our May event, I'm excited that we're going to be welcoming the maple industry here. I assume we're going to have a maple-related breakfast with specialists from forestry policy and the business sector talking about the maple industry. And then finally, for those of you sticking around for the additional WMAO conference, we'll have a short break, and then you'll be reconvening at 9:45 or 9:50. If this has piqued your interest and you weren't planning to stick around for those things, you are welcome to sort of join in the further programming we have here today. So thank you very much for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.